Is Ripple's selling of XRP suppressing XRP's price? In this video, that is exactly what we're going to be covering and talk about whether or not Ripple should simply burn their escrow and make the current circulating supply the total circulating supply of XRP. Guys, this is a question that comes up all the time, and in this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts around all of this, so make sure to stick around for this whole thing. Like always, your support means so much to this channel. Thank you to everyone who takes the time to like these videos and subscribe to the channel. These two simple things really do help me out so much. Also, if you ever need a place to buy some XRP, make sure to check out my favorite exchange Uphold down in the description of this video. With that said, let's jump right into it, and I hope you guys enjoy the content. So guys, this is going to be a really interesting video because a lot of people look to Ripple's escrow of close to 45 billion XRP and say, well, that's obviously suppressing XRP's price, right? If Ripple is constantly selling XRP onto the open market, well, then that's suppressing the price of XRP, and therefore Ripple's escrow should be burned so that they can't sell any more XRP onto the market. A lot of people also look at this and say, wait, if we just burned Ripple's escrow, then the price of XRP should double overnight because there would be about half as much XRP available, making XRP twice as valuable. And these tend to be two of the biggest arguments on why Ripple should simply burn the escrow and we should just make the total circulating supply of XRP what's already in the market. But I want to give you some counter arguments that I think a lot of people don't really think about. And the first one I think is going to be extremely interesting because this is one of the rare things in history where we actually have proof of what happens when you do burn an escrow of a cryptocurrency. And it's very rare to have a real world example in crypto because the asset class is so young, right? Typically, when we're making monetary policy decisions, we can say, oh, well, we shouldn't inflate the currency because take a look at what happened in Venezuela in 19 whatever, right? You can go look at a time in history and say, okay, well, there's a great example of this exact thing happening. But that's rare in crypto because the entire cryptocurrency asset class is only about 15 years old. So we're still learning a lot of these lessons. But something very interesting is there is a project that had an escrow very similar to the XRP Ledger's escrow and Ripple's escrow, and they burned the entire thing. And that project, as many of you probably know, is XLM. Now, I want to show you a price chart of XLM and show you exactly where the Stellar Foundation burned their escrow and just show you what impact it had on the price of XLM moving forward. So let's take a look at it. Here's the long-term price chart of XLM. Encircled in green here is November of 2019, or that rough time period, because who cares, right? Maybe it took the market a little bit to digest it. Maybe the market knew it was going to happen beforehand. Anyway, this is about the time period in which the Stellar Foundation burned the escrow. And what you'll notice is there was no impact on the price of XLM. Billions of XLM burned out of existence overnight, and the price didn't even react. And this is really important to understand because essentially the market was saying, yeah, we don't care about this. And maybe we even look at this as a bad thing because the market continued to trend downward. So simply deleting those tokens did absolutely nothing for the price. And that's the first thing we need to address here because a lot of people say, oh, well, if we just burned Ripple's escrow, right? Well, then all of that XRP would be gone from existence and XRP would double overnight. But the one time in history we have seen this happen, it has done absolutely nothing to the price of the underlying token. Now, there's another very interesting thing to consider here because the Stellar Foundation burned, right, that XLM. And what you can see is even though there is no more new XLM coming onto the market, it didn't change how XLM traded. It continued to trade in lockstep with XRP. So despite the fact that Ripple had still had the escrow and was still distributing XRP, and the Stellar Foundation had burned all that XLM, the prices stayed relatively the same throughout this entire point in history. Now, this is the first really important thing to understand. Because I think a lot of people come into this with the assumption that if we did this, there would be some instantaneous monetary reward. But what we're seeing right now is there would be no reward. In fact, the token might even go down if this was to happen. Now, I think another very interesting question is, why would the token actually potentially go down? And we'll talk about that in a minute, but I want to talk about something else very important here. For a long time, one of the very early co-founders of the XRP ledger, Jed McCaleb, was selling out of a very large number of XRP, close to 10 billion XRP. And a lot of people assumed that as soon as Jed McCaleb was done selling that XRP, you would likely see a pretty big increase in the price of XRP, right? Because 10 billion tokens, that's a huge amount. All that selling probably influenced XRP's price. But it's super interesting because when you take a look at the long-term price chart of XRP, and we'll pull that up right now, what you'll notice is when Jed McCaleb stopped selling XRP, almost nothing happened to the price of XRP. And I know the things we're talking about right now are very counterintuitive. It seems like those kinds of things would have a big impact and would be beneficial to the price of XRP. But Jed McCaleb was essentially selling out of his XRP for a very long time. I'm just going to do a broad circle, but it was something everywhere in this region. And I actually made it a little too long. So let me try this again. Jed McCaleb stopped selling out his XRP somewhere around here. And this goes all the way back, right? All the way back to these very early days. And he was selling his XRP through this entire time period. But when he stopped selling his XRP, there was no impact on the XRP price chart. So these are two concrete data points that point us to the fact that if Ripple burned their entire escrow of XRP, very likely it would have no impact on the price of XRP. So let's talk about why that's the case. Well, the simple fact of the matter is, and a lot of people confuse this, there is a set number of XRP out there, 100 billion. There can never be more. And the market has already accepted that, right? The market is already saying 100 billion XRP. It makes no difference to the market now what happens and where those XRPs are being held. Whether they're being held by Ripple, whether they're being held by me, it doesn't matter. Those XRPs are already issued. A lot of people confuse this with inflation. It's not. Inflation would be if that 100 billion token supply was moving up. So next year, say it was 110 billion, and then 120 billion, and a couple years would be 200 billion. That would be inflation, but there's no inflation on the XRP ledger. In fact, there's deflation. There will only ever be a maximum of 100 billion tokens, and that number is actually going down. So the market doesn't care who's actually holding those tokens per se. They're already on the network. And therefore, deleting those tokens, moving them from one person to another, it doesn't make a big difference in the grand scheme of things. The market has already factored these tokens in. And this is what a lot of people don't understand when it comes down to Ripple's escrow. The market already knows those tokens exist. It's already been factored into everything. And in fact, the market actually might even think that's bullish. Let's talk about why Ripple's escrow is actually bullish now, because this is also very important. When Ripple got sued by the SEC, they needed a lot of money to fight off the SEC. And they weren't only defending themselves, they were defending the entire XRP ecosystem. If XRP was declared a security, it would have been nuclear for XRP's liquidity. And even if it didn't only impact Ripple, right, which it would have impacted anyone using the XRP ledger. Therefore, Ripple was able to use the escrow to fight against the SEC and protect the XRP ledger. Ripple is also working with very large banking institutions like many of us know. Ripple was able to use XRP from the escrow and purchase a company called Mickle. Mickle is actually one of the largest custodians for these big institutions on the back end. And because of this, Ripple was able to integrate their product suites into a lot of these large banking institutions and connect them to the XRP ledger. So right here, we can see that the XRP escrow that Ripple holds isn't used just to dump. It's a strategic war chest. What it's doing is essentially providing Ripple with ways to build out the XRP ledger ecosystem using a massive, massive pool of funds that are used to build out the network. If Ripple didn't have those funds, they wouldn't have been able to fight against the SEC and protect the XRP ledger. They wouldn't be able to take their tentacles and intertwine them into these legacy financial institutions, because Ripple wouldn't have any capital to actually do these initiatives. And because of this, because Ripple can act as a steward of the XRP ledger with this strategic war chest of XRP, they can drive adoption. Whether people like it or not, the entire world runs on money. And Ripple having a ton of money is ultimately extremely bullish for the entire XRP ledger ecosystem. They're able to help fund projects. They're able to do a lot of things that they wouldn't be able to do if they didn't have that war chest behind them. And it also keeps them committed to the XRP ledger. If Ripple didn't have this war chest of XRP, there wouldn't be so much of an initiative for them to be remaining focused on the XRP ledger. But because their success directly impacts their balance sheet with the amount of XRP they have, they are fully committed to building out the success of the XRP ledger because they financially benefit from that happening. Guys, when you really look at it, you can see that the escrow Ripple holds not only is a massive strategic advantage to the company, but also to the entire XRP ledger. And there's just simply no proof out there that destroying this escrow would be in any way beneficial for XRP. In fact, almost all the real world evidence we have actually points to the fact that it could actually be massively detrimental if we destroyed the escrow. So I think these are just really important points to factor in. Ripple's escrow is a strategic war chest, and they can make sure XRP ends up in the people's hands who actually matter, rather than just this very early niche phase of cryptocurrency where a lot of enthusiasts like us were able to get in early and a lot of people were able to kind of figure this stuff out in the back end before the big institutions get involved. Ripple said, yeah, that's great, right? Like everyone could go own XRP. But eventually, these very large financial institutions are going to want in, and we need to make sure there's a token supply left for them to be allocated. That is what Ripple's strategy has been with XRP. And in my opinion, it's a game changer that's massively beneficial for the long-term success of the network. Someone told me this the other day, and I'm going to leave it here. In the very early days when essentially the oil industry started to boom in the United States, all the big oil tycoons were laying all the pipelines. And a lot of people were looking at it and saying, this is a massive waste of money. Why are you going to do this, right? Why are you going to weigh all these pipelines? No one really knew about the importance of oil. It's like, this is a massive waste. But then the second the oil started flowing, everyone woke up. And everyone realized what they were doing was laying the infrastructure for something that was about to change the world. That is exactly what Ripple is doing. But they need money to do it. They need an asset. They need a strategic reserve weapon, and that's what XRP is to the entire Ripple and XRP ledger ecosystem. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed this update, and for now, Mickle out.